Jake Reiner had convinced himself that this Christmas would finally bring everyone back together. After months of silence and emotional distance, he pictured a quiet return to the Brentwood house, holding on to one modest hope, sharing a table with his parents again, as if time could be reset. That fragile vision collapsed on the night of December 14th, when a phone call cut through everything. Rob Reiner and Michelle were dead, savagely murdered, their lives extinguished in a storm of repeated knife wounds. And then came the name that stopped Jake cold: Nick Reiner, his younger brother, the boy he had protected for years, the one he never imagined would stand at the center of such horror. Overwhelmed by grief and fury, Jake later spoke on KCBS, delivering words that left listeners stunned. "I warned my parents. I feared he would one day do something that couldn't be taken back." It wasn't a moment of anger, it was the shattering of a truth he had carried alone for far too long. Jake went further, exposing the family's buried tensions, the quiet imbalance, the leniency and favoritism that had surrounded Nick, and how love mixed with denial can slowly bend toward disaster. So when Nick called from the darkness, pleading for help, insisting on his innocence and asking Jake to secure his release, the answer was no. Not from hatred, but from a brutal clarity Jake could no longer escape. This family had been breaking for years, and Nick was the final fracture that sealed its fate. By December 17th, Los Angeles felt unnaturally still. Nick climbed the cold courthouse steps, each footfall heavy with consequence, while miles away Jake sat beneath the unforgiving lights of the KCBS studio, where his story began and where the full weight of his unraveling finally came into view. The studio lights hollowed his face, carving deeper shadows beneath eyes that had forgotten what sleep felt like. The dark suit draped over his tall frame no longer carried the composed authority of a seasoned journalist. Instead, it hung heavy, shaped by years of unspoken strain. Jake sat upright before the camera, yet his body betrayed him, shoulders rigid, hands clenched tightly against the desk until the color drained from his knuckles. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, as though every word had to be forced into the open. "I've sat in this chair through countless long nights," he said quietly, "but never one like this." From there, his story unraveled not in neat chronology, but in scattered fragments, guided by memory rather than order. Memories of growing up beneath the shadow of the Reiner name, a surname that drew smiles from others, yet had always felt to him like an ill-fitting coat he was expected to wear before he was ready. Jake Reiner was born on May 6, 1991, in Los Angeles, into a household where creativity moved as freely as conversation. He inherited a rich artistic legacy from his father, legendary director Rob Reiner, and from his mother, Michelle Singer, a gifted photographer in her own right. As the eldest son, Jake grew up surrounded by laughter and imagination, often under the watchful presence of his grandfather, Carl Reiner. In that home, humor, storytelling, and classic films were woven casually into daily life, creating a childhood that, from the outside, appeared to be an ideal portrait of love, warmth, and creative passion. But beneath that polished surface, Jake's early years were far from a fairy tale. Growing up alongside his younger sister Romy and younger brother Nick, he learned early what it meant to be the oldest. Yielding became instinctive. By Jake's own account, accommodating Nick was less a choice than a role assigned the moment his brother was born. Nick was smaller, more fragile, and so Jake stepped aside. First it was toys, then personal space, and eventually the explanations he had every right to give. "He's still little," the adults would repeat. Jake would nod, swallowing his frustration, slowly convincing himself that being an older brother meant learning how to endure in silence. In Jake's recollection, Nick was always the gravity at the center of the family. When Nick lashed out, everything shifted to calm him. When he cried, time itself seemed to pause. Jake learned, almost instinctively, how to fade into the background, to sit quietly at the edges of rooms, to manage his own emotions so nothing became harder for anyone else. "I'm okay," he would say without thinking, even though no one had really stopped long enough to ask if that was true. Silence became his language, retreat his survival. What began as an act of love slowly transformed into something far more damaging. Rob Reiner and Michelle loved Nick with the anxious intensity of parents afraid of losing their child to something they could not name or control. They protected him, justified his behavior, and told themselves that patience and understanding would eventually smooth every rough edge. Jake remembers his father brushing off Nick's excesses with humor, his mother pulling Nick close and whispering reassurance, "He's just struggling right now." Jake stood nearby, understanding the fear behind their love, yet feeling an invisible line quietly drawn between himself and the rest of the family. He never accused his parents of wrongdoing. Jake knew their devotion to Nick was born of fear, not indifference. But as he grew older, he began to understand the cost of that devotion, and who was paying it. He became the stable one, the reasonable one, the child who absorbed what remained unspoken, the restraint, the compromise, the constant expectation to be easy. "I'm used to it," he once told his mother, half smiling, half confessing. Michelle smiled back, never realizing those words carried a quiet request to be seen. As a teenager, Jake found his escape in baseball, a tradition almost sacred in the Reiner family, passed down from Carl to Rob, and then to him. Rob would take Jake to Dodger Stadium time and again, father and son sitting shoulder to shoulder through countless games. Beneath the California sun, surrounded by noise and motion, they shared moments that felt uncomplicated and real, brief islands of connection Jake rarely spoke about, but held on to fiercely. "My father gave his love of baseball to me, and I gave it to Jake," Rob once said with gentle pride, recalling trips to the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. Those memories, simple yet profound, moved him to tears. Moments where being a father felt pure and complete. But while baseball anchored Jake's bond with his father, another force was quietly shaping his adolescence. By the time Nick was just 15, darker patterns had begun to emerge. The first shadows of addiction crept in, unnoticed by some, underestimated by others, setting the stage for a fracture that would only widen with time. In the beginning, the warning signs were subtle enough to ignore, Nick's empty gaze lingering too long, sudden bursts of rage that flared and vanished, nights when he disappeared without explanation. Jake remembers watching from a distance, thinking his brother was reaching out in the only way he knew how. But that plea was soon drowned out by disorder. Year after year, Jake saw the same pattern repeat itself, Nick slipping out of school and into treatment programs, only to return again and again to the same fragile starting line, as if caught inside a cycle no one knew how to break. Every return carried renewed hope. Each promise sparked belief all over again. Jake recalls quiet dinners where Nick sat hunched at the table, hands trembling, voice barely audible. "This time it's different," he would say. "I mean it." Rob listened with unwavering faith. Michelle would stretch across the table, clutching her son's hand as though that vow were the last thread keeping him close. Jake stood beside them, wanting to trust the moment, yet haunted by the memory of how many times he had already believed before. What cut deepest for Jake was not only watching his brother unravel, but watching his parents unravel with him. With each relapse, Rob seemed to grow older overnight, his posture sagging, his pauses longer, his silence heavier. It was a quiet kind of fatigue, the sort that seeps into a person and never fully leaves. No one named it aloud, but it filled every room. Michelle existed in a constant state of alertness, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for proof that Nick was still alive, waiting for reassurance that he hadn't slipped entirely into the dark. Once, Jake overheard her whispering in the kitchen, her voice shaking, "As long as he's breathing, I won't give up." There were nights when Nick returned home wild and unreachable, and Jake watched his father instinctively step between the two brothers, positioning himself like a shield. Behind closed doors, Michelle cried softly, careful to keep her grief hidden. That was when Jake realized their home no longer operated as a family. It had become a place of endurance, measured hour by hour, not day by day. "We have to save him," Rob said once. Jake said nothing. Another question had already taken root in his mind. Who saves the ones who are doing the saving? During those years, Jake learned to observe more than he spoke. He began to imagine escape, building a future untouched by emergency and fear. Fame unsettled him. So did the slow loss of privacy, the unspoken rule that his brother's addiction must be kept out of sight. He would stand in the shadows backstage, watching others step forward into the spotlight, and quietly wonder if he was meant to do the same. Sometimes the thought slipped free, barely louder than breath. What if this was never my path? The question followed him through his growing years, lingering like a shadow he could never quite outrun. So even with the Reiner name resting heavily on his shoulders, Jake made a deliberate choice to stay out of the spotlight. Instead of chasing visibility, he charted a quieter path, enrolling at Syracuse University and committing himself to broadcast journalism. It was there, away from Hollywood expectations, that his fascination with storytelling truly ignited. "I only have one other passion," he once admitted, "and that's news." It was a simple sentence, but it marked a clear break from the shadow of his father's legacy. After graduation, Jake started where few were watching, first at KION in Salinas, then at KPRC Channel 2 in Houston between 2016 and 2018. In those early years, colleagues came to value his composure and discipline, particularly during tense law enforcement coverage. His career advanced gradually, small markets to larger ones, feature stories to sports, never rushed, never flashy, but unmistakably earned. On camera, Jake became a steady presence, a measured voice, focused eyes, and a calm authority that invited trust. Yet when the lights shut off, the microphone was removed, and the jacket came off, he returned to the same private stillness he had learned to carry for years. In Houston, and later at KCBS/Call in Los Angeles, his life revolved around the relentless pace of journalism. Sirens, breaking news, late nights, and interviews with people caught at their most fragile moments. He delivered their stories with restraint and empathy, even as he carefully kept his own at a distance. Jake never denied his family's fame, but he refused to rely on it. He maintained a careful separation, determined that his reputation would come solely from his work. Baseball remained his one unbroken thread to home. Through the podcast The Incline Dodgers, he and close friends talked endlessly about the team they loved, mixing humor with sharp insight, a quiet joy that connected him back to the legacy passed down through generations. Whenever Jake spoke about KCBS, something in him shifted, as though that newsroom represented the last solid footing he trusted. He recalled overnight shifts, empty streets, lives fractured by tragedy, stories he once delivered with professional detachment. "I chose journalism," he said softly, "because I believed that if I stayed behind the story, life wouldn't come for me." A faint smile followed, brief, distant, never quite reaching his eyes. "I was wrong." Then came an unexpected turn. Jake returned to acting, not as a famous heir, but as someone stepping in cautiously, almost late. Opportunities arrived slowly, moving from television to film, from light comedy to heavier drama. There was no sudden breakout, no loud arrival. Instead, he settled into each role with restraint, carrying the quiet depth of someone who had lived through more than he ever said aloud. Gradually, audiences began to see him clearly, not simply as Rob Reiner's son, but as an actor with his own cadence, his own subtle gravity, and an emotional weight that lingered long after the scene ended. By 2023, that sense of being truly seen began to solidify. Appearances in Curb Your Enthusiasm, For All Mankind, and American Crime Story quietly built toward a breakthrough moment in the independent film love and tax. The role marked a turning point. In 2024, Jake's performance earned him the Best Actor award at the Myrtle Beach International Film Festival, recognition that felt earned rather than inherited. Even in smaller but memorable roles, including Shock and Awe, something distinct emerged, a performer shaped by observation and restraint, where a journalist's eye blended seamlessly with a legacy of storytelling. Still, in his most unguarded moments, Jake confessed a truth he rarely said out loud. Between takes, in the silence before a scene reset, his thoughts always returned to his parents. Every time he stepped in front of the camera, he wasn't just acting for a director or an audience. He was acting for them. In his mind, Rob stood just off-set, arms folded, reserved but unmistakably proud. Michelle lingered nearby, softer, watching as if through an unseen lens, absorbing every detail. There were nights when Jake called home, carefully steadying his voice while his pulse betrayed him. He talked about auditions, about landing his first independent film among thousands of hopefuls. "I did it," he said, half joking, half breathless. On the other end, Rob paused in that familiar silence before replying, simply, "I knew you would." Michelle laughed, emotional and unsteady. I always knew you'd find where you belonged. Jake clung to those words. Each small award, every quiet acknowledgement, he wanted to share with them first. He sent photos from set, links to articles, short videos recorded between scenes. Michelle answered with long, heartfelt messages. Rob responded sparingly, his pride concise and unembellished. Jake understood. When his father once wrote, "You're on the right path," Jake reread the sentence countless times, letting it anchor him. Through everything, one certainty remained unshaken. This Christmas, he would go home. After years of distance, silence, and unresolved conversations, he would sit again in that familiar living room, placing his hard-won accomplishments on the table like offerings that had taken too long to arrive. He imagined the moment so vividly it felt almost tangible. Rob nodding slowly, that quiet look of approval. Michelle squeezing his hand, smiling as she said, "Our son." The thought alone warmed his chest. Jake rehearsed it all, the flight, the gifts, even the exact words he would say when he crossed the threshold. "I'm home." In his heart, this Christmas would close every gap, soften every misunderstanding. For the first time, he believed he would stand before his parents not as a boy still finding his footing, but as a man who had finally made them proud. And then it was gone. So suddenly he barely had time to understand what had been taken. On December 14th, while Jake was in New York trying to complete work on a film he was directing, the call came without warning. Cold, sudden, unforgiving. His parents were gone. Rob Reiner and Michelle had been killed inside the Brentwood home where Jake's childhood memories still lived. The attack was brutal and swift, multiple stab wounds to the neck and chest, violence so extreme that there was almost no chance to survive. And before his mind could even grasp that reality, a second truth followed, far more devastating than the first. Nick, his younger brother. He was being identified as the suspect. Jake didn't scream. He didn't fall. He stood perfectly still, as if gravity itself had let go. It felt like drifting, an endless, soundless drop with nothing to grab onto. In an instant, Christmas stopped being a homecoming. It became a void, two empty chairs that would never again be filled. The pain was too large for words, pressing in from every direction, relentless and suffocating. Jake flew back to Los Angeles immediately and found his sister, Romy. They held on to each other, crying, clinging to whatever fragments of family remained. Later, they would speak of an unimaginable pain we live with every moment. But in those first hours, Jake felt utterly alone, standing inside a city built on light and illusion that had suddenly gone dark. Then grief began to shift. Something sharper pushed through the numbness. Anger, delayed, raw, uncontrollable. And with it came truths so heavy they stole the breath from those who heard them. "I warned them," Jake said, his voice trembling, soaked in despair and fury. "I warned my parents." Months before everything shattered, long before the headlines, he had tried to stop it. Not in rage, not in judgment, but in fear. Deep, instinctive fear. When Jake learned that Nick, after years of homelessness, addiction, and countless failed attempts at recovery, wanted to move back into the house, panic took over. He called his parents immediately. His voice shook. He begged, "Please don't let him come back. He's not stable. He's completely out of control. Be careful. Don't let him get too close." Jake remembers his hands trembling as he spoke. "I don't feel safe," he told them. "I'm afraid. Afraid that one day he'll do something that can't be undone." When Jake later repeated those words, his jaw tightened, every muscle in his face locked with restrained anguish. He wasn't assigning blame. He was speaking as someone who had watched danger approach from far away, powerless to stop it, forced to witness its advance. He said he pleaded with them to set boundaries, to protect themselves, to not let Nick stay too long. "Please," he had said, "if not for me, then for yourselves." But fear lost to hope. As it had throughout Jake's life, love once again outweighed caution. Rob and Michelle believed, desperately, that loving their youngest son enough would save him. That giving him shelter would bring him back. That this time, somehow, things would be different. Jake could still hear his father's voice as clearly as if the call had never ended. Gentle. Steady. Nick is your brother, Rob had said. He's trying. We're family. We don't turn away from each other. Michelle reinforced that belief, her words soft but certain, promising they would watch Nick closely, that they would guide him, that love would be enough this time. Jake argued back, panic bleeding into every sentence. He spoke of Nick's violent episodes, the years lost to the streets, the damage addiction had carved deep into his behavior. But compassion prevailed, and now the cost of that choice was irreversible. I never imagined he could do something like this, Jake broke down, his words collapsing in front of a stunned audience. Grief ignited into something raw and scorching, directed at the brother he had once shielded without hesitation. That love twisted into agony. Nick killed our parents. Nick destroyed everything. His voice shook as the truth tore through him. I warned them, and nobody listened. Tears streamed freely, the betrayal cutting deepest because it came from his own blood. But rage is never permanent. It turned inward, collapsing into a suffocating guilt that left Jake interrogating himself without mercy. Could I have stopped this? He wondered. Should I have come home sooner? Pushed harder? Refused to let it go? His voice fell to a whisper. If I had gone back earlier, the sentence trailed off, unanswered, leaving only relentless self-blame in its wake. When Jake spoke of Nick after that, his emotions knotted into something impossible to separate. Anger, grief, pity, horror, all layered together. He's my brother, Jake said, his voice breaking under the contradiction, but he's also the person who took my parents from me. He turned away, as if the air itself couldn't carry the weight of those words. His body surrendered where language failed, shoulders collapsing inward, hands trembling, tears falling in a quiet, unstoppable stream, like a dam that had held too long and finally burst. I warned them, Jake repeated. Not long after Nick Reiner was taken into custody, Jake's phone vibrated once. A single notification. One name. He knew it without looking. Nick. Jake stared at the screen, frozen, his thumb hovering as though answering would pull him straight back into a nightmare that refused to loosen its grip. When he finally answered, Nick's voice poured out in a rush, ragged, frantic, soaked in the panic of a man who had just lost everything. He spoke without stopping, as if silence itself might cause Jake to hang up. Nick insisted he was innocent. Said things had spiraled out of control. Said the truth wasn't what people thought. Please believe me, he begged, his voice cracking. You're all I have left. Jake closed his eyes, gripping the phone until his hand ached. That voice, once small, once frightened, belonged to the boy he had spent his entire life protecting. Then the figure was spoken aloud. $4 million for bail. Flat, merciless, delivered like a final lifeline tossed into pitch darkness. Nick pleaded with Jake to help him, to use whatever money, connections, or influence he had left to pull him out. I can't survive in here, Nick said, his voice breaking into something close to sobbing. Please. Just help me this one time. Every word landed like a blow, where years of brotherhood crashed into fresh, unbearable grief. Jake stayed silent, his mind filling with images of Rob and Michelle, parents who would never again be protected, never again be rescued. He could hear his own breathing, loud and uneven, like a man standing between two collapsing cliffs. Nick, Jake finally said, his voice hollow, stripped of warmth. I can't. The words were simple, but they dropped with crushing finality. I can't use money to escape the truth. On the other end of the line, Nick unraveled, desperation curdling into rage. He accused Jake of betrayal, of abandoning him the way everyone else had. Jake squeezed his eyes shut as tears ran freely down his face. I'm not abandoning you, he said, barely holding himself together. But I can't save you like this. It wasn't a decision made by reason, it was the last boundary left to draw, and it came far too late, at a cost that felt unbearable. The call ended in broken breaths and sudden silence. Jake stared at the darkened screen, feeling as though he had cut the final thread tying him to his brother. He didn't know whether Nick understood. He didn't know if he had done the right thing. He only knew one devastating truth. Sometimes love is not enough, and learning that may be the cruelest punishment of all. When Jake's report concluded on the night of December 17th, many viewers remained motionless in front of their televisions, as if standing up would make the nightmare real. Social media responded almost instantly, but not with spectacle or outrage. Instead, there were fragments of pain. "I couldn't breathe watching this. I've never seen a report this raw. He wasn't a reporter tonight, he was a son." Many admitted they cried despite never knowing the Reiner family. Others confessed they felt like witnesses to something too intimate, too fragile to be shared publicly. Some turned the TV off halfway, only to turn it back on moments later, unable to endure it, yet unable to look away. One comment read, "I watch the news to understand the world. Tonight, I felt like I was watching pain no one should ever have to carry in public." That discomfort lingered. Online, grief unfolded through tears. Mourning Rob Reiner, whose films once brought laughter to millions now darkened by tragedy, and heartbreak for Jake and Romy, left behind to survive the unthinkable. "They didn't just lose their parents," one post said. "They lost the idea of family itself." Thousands echoed the same sentiment. That night, people hugged loved ones tighter. They called siblings, parents, just to hear a familiar voice. Jake's tragedy stopped being only his own. It awakened a shared fear that everything can collapse inside the place we trust most, home. In the days that followed, Jake was haunted by relentless nightmares, visions of his parents' final moments, the echo of his warnings rendered meaningless.